Hi, Diane. How are you doing?
Whoa.
Hey, Johnny, how you doing?
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
We're going to try to be pretty quick as we get going here this morning, just because of time. We're going to be to the gun relative to just squeezing everybody in today. So I'll wait to kind of give some ground rules for how we're going to run today. We're going to be pretty strict on time. So if you go over, you may be just muted. Some time, point in time, and we will move on. So be aware.
I put the list in the chat of the order of people signed up, and I'll keep doing that as people are coming in.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. We're up to only 14, so we got a few more folks. And like last week, we talked a little bit about some other folks perhaps joining us from outside the class, other professionals, natural resource professionals that were linked to your work. So if you see some unfamiliar faces, we won't have time to do introductions prior. But what we'll do, if folks would like to and have time to stick around with some introductions just after the class, we'll maybe spend 15 minutes there. I understand some of you have to run to another class post this one. So if you need to drop off, feel free to do that. We'll have a recording, which will have some of those introductions on them once we get through everyone's talk. So we're 11:01 now. I believe, Diane, you were the first one up this morning?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So without wasting any time, approximately 15 minutes per talk, 5 for questions and answers. If you want to eat into that time a little bit, feel free. I will give you a 5-minute countdown. I'll probably just say 5. Sometimes it's hard to see. So if I butt in and you hear 5, that's just me. You can just keep on rolling. And I'll also give you a 1 minute at the end. And then we'll roll with our questions. And so with that, let's start with Diane. I believe you should have access to share your screen, and it is all you, Diane.
Okay. All right. Well, greetings from the family farm in Iowa. It's where I am right now. So a little change of scenery for me. But anyway, on to the cool stuff. So my talk is looking at the dynamics of salmonid rivers over time as related to climate drivers. As you can see on this photo is a floodplain in the Taku watershed, which is in northern British Columbia. You can see it's a fairly dynamic system and it's glacially fed, so it's very dynamic. So I'm basically interested in how do floodplain patterns shift from a steady state mosaic as a result of a changing climate. So just some little conceptual background on the steady state or shifting habitat mosaic of rivers. Some previous work we've done on the Nyack floodplain here in Northwest Montana. We use very old school GIS to map basic cover types on a floodplain over a 60-year time period. Here we're just showing cover types of forest, water, cobble, and so forth. So the basics of the shifting habitat mosaic says, although these natural disturbances occur, such as flooding, the distribution and abundance of these habitats remain relatively same over the time. So the channel moves around, forest patches move around, but the relative abundance of these habitats stay the same. So obviously this is a function of hydrology and regional climatic patterns. Here's just to see how you can see how dynamic the river channel has been in the last 60 years here. And briefly, here's the hydrology. I'll go into this a little bit more in the next slide. So essentially, mapping the cover types, just pay attention here to the green bar. This is the amount of mature forest on the floodplain over this 60-year period. So you can see that this is 1945. It was really dominated by mature forests. 64 was the flood of record here on the Flathead, and it really did some work on the floodplain and reduced the amount of forest cover over time. And then more recent years, the floodplain has started to recover, regaining more forest and looking back to what it was initially in 1945, which is our base. So how does that relate to hydrology? The black line here is the peak discharge for each year. And the two little blue bars is just showing you the number of days above a certain discharge or recurrence intervals. So even though you might have a major discharge, intermediate floods that are sustained for 4, 5, 6, 7 days might actually do more work on the floodplain than one major discharge. But just to highlight, you can see this period here in the 50s, 60s, early 70s was very dynamic hydrologically speaking. Conversely, if we look at low flows, it's kind of the reverse pattern. The black line here is showing the minimum discharge for each year, and the yellow bars is showing the days below base flow. So you can kind of see that there's a reverse pattern, obviously, preceding the 40s and 50s. We had a lot of low flows. And after the 1970s, we're starting to have more lower flows, not as dynamic hydraulically. So if we look at a regional climatic pattern, such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, which is similar to La Nina, El Nino activities, but it's over a multi-decadal period of time. So looking at this chart, red is what we call the warming phase of the PDO, and blue is the cooling phase. So the cooling phase of the PDO that happened between the 50s, 60s, and 70s totally line up with this dynamic hydraulic environment that caused this change on the floodplain. But preceding that and after that, we see this more warming indice of the PDO, suggesting that we get more succession in the floodplain and more vegetation growth. So through this little example, we show that climate variation determines the level of disturbance occurring in the floodplain for a given time period, such that the cooling phase of the PDO had larger, more frequent floods, and we saw higher turnover of floodplain habitats, while the warming phase of the PDO had decrease in magnitude and frequency of floods and lower turnover of floodplain cover type and a succession dominated environment for these floodplain. But over the 60-year time frame, we can see that this is still kind of a stable, steady state that we see in the floodplain pattern over time. So that was just one example or 60-year time period in Northwest Montana. What I'm really interested in is taking this logic and spreading it across the North Pacific Rim, looking at these very productive salmonid rivers. So we're going to look at the time period that we have the Landsat and see if floodplains are becoming more vegetated, staying stable, or becoming less vegetated. So to do this, I'm going to use this watershed in northern British Columbia. I have few other projects going on in this watershed. That's why I chose this one. It's about 11% glaciated and 1,750 kilometers square. So pretty good large watershed. In this analysis, I'm going to compare the Tulsaqua. This is a highly glaciated watershed. 40% of this watershed is glaciated, to this upper Taku, which has only 4% glaciated, but similar dynamics. So within this watershed, there's minimal to no human disturbance, but there's some localized mining, but no dams, no whatever. So what's happening to this watershed is pretty much climate driven. So objectives, describe and quantify floodplain pattern over time using the Landsat data record 84 to 2020. Compare the patterns between the Tulsaquah and the upper Taku subwatersheds. And relate these patterns to climate indices such as precip, temperature, PDO. Also look at, there is a gauge on the main stem of the Taku, so we can look at hydrology and also glacier retreat, because in that Tulsaquah subwatershed, the glacier has receded over 3 kilometers since 1984. So there's a lot of glacier recession occurring in that small little watershed. So methods we're all familiar with. I'm going to use the spectral mixing analysis for the individual floodplains, looking at the time period from July 1st to September 30th. Shows this period, hopefully it's going to be cloud-free and past the peak runoff. And I'm going to do a classification for water, cobble, and vegetation. My quality control is, I'm only going to use the years where I have at least 90% of the floodplain that is covered. Some years I don't reach that threshold due to cloud cover. So that's my little quality control there. Obviously, I'm going to derive climate parameters for the individual subwatersheds and relate these floodplain patterns. Specifically, I'm just going to look at percent vegetated today, because looking at the percent vegetated in the floodplain is a more stable land cover than the water or cobble. So here's just some quick snapshots of how these floodplains look from 84 to 2020. This is the Tulsaquah. As you can see, in 84, a lot of the floodplain is in cobble. And if we bump up here into 2020, we see it's become extremely vegetated, especially up here at the upper end of the floodplain. And if you notice, here's the extent of the glacier in 84, and here's the pro-glacial lake existing in 2020. If we look at the main stem Taku, similar patterns, a very dynamic system, but just on a quick look, not as much change as you see in the Tulsaquah. So using the nifty little linear trend fit, just on a glimpse here, you can see in the Tulsaquah, we have more positive progression in the NDVI values in the Tulsaquah than in the main stem Taku. Now, if we plot the 3 main land cover types over time, just a simple line graph here, we can see in the Tulsaquah amount around the around 2005, 2006, we see a big change from a very dynamic system to seeing where it's becoming more vegetated. So that's a very interesting pattern. And then if we bump over to the main stem Taku, it seems to be a more stable system, although you can see a slight increase in the vegetation over time, very slight. So thanks to Johnny. Gotta give a shout out to Johnny for his random forest talk. And I spent an extra hour with me walking me through some logic here. So I used the random forest analysis, playing with the different climate variables and glacial retreat and the hydrology. And in the Tulsaquah, you can see retreat was the biggest variable or indicator, although we have a widespread of the whiskers. But we see glacial retreat, PDO, and max temperature were the best indicators of the vegetation growth in the Tulsaquah. And you can see it explained almost 80% of the variation using those 3 variables. Over on the main stem Taku, we still see the PDO and max temperature are strong variables, and snow water equivalent popped out there. I didn't have glacial retreat for this whole watershed. I just didn't have the time to work up that data. But you can see, obviously, the Tulsaquah is much more dynamic than the Taku. As you can expect, with the amount of glaciation and retreat in the Tulsaquah, that might explain this dynamics. But there's another factor I just want to briefly discuss in the Tulsaquah is this eucalypts or eucalypts, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, is these glacial outburst floods. They occur by having a dam lake, as you see here in this upper photo, that occurs within the glacier or next to the glacier. And then when it reaches a high level, it exceeds the dam and outburst floods occur, usually once a year or multiple times a year. So this happens twice, or there's two lakes in the Tulsaquah drainage that occur. So here's the Tulsaquah Lake. And for your information, here's the head of the floodplain down here. And then there's one up here that's called Lake No Lake. Interesting, cool name for outburst lake. So this is another dynamic that I haven't really got a handle on and how to plug this into our analysis, but I know this is affecting this system also. So it's just, here's what it looked like in '84 compared to 2020. You can see how the arms of both of these have receded over time. So this is, the outburst floods are receding over time. They're not as dynamic as they used to be. And from previous work, people have detected these in the USGS hydrograph. Here's one from Tulsaquah Lake, and here's a peak from Lake No Lake. So within this year, there was 3 outburst floods from the 2 dammed lakes. So briefly, Tulsaquah Lake was formed in the 1800s, reached its maximum around 1920. But as I said, it has diminished in size and the flooding substantial. Lake No Lake was formed in the 1970s, is still functioning as a eucalypt, but its volume has decreased and discharge has diminished also. But another thing to factor in is with this glacial recession, future lakes might likely form in other avenue or other places within this glacial field. So in conclusion, we showed that the PDO and max annual temperature appear to influence the shift in more vegetated floodplains for both the Tulsaquah and Taku floodplains. And in the Tulsaquah, we see the glacial retreat has strong influence, most likely by buffering these outburst floods and containing more sediment, which ironically is potentially good for salmon productivity in this system. Right now it's really dynamic, but once the channel gets a little more stabilized, it is a more productive system for salmon. So we recently published a paper where we talk about conceptually about glacial retreat and the productivity of salmon. So, and this is one case where glacial retreat is actually might be potentially good for a species. And as I just briefly provided, the eucalypts provide an interesting twist to the story. And we're trying to get a handle on how we can better incorporate the timing or picking out those floods better. So future work, better understanding of these eucalypts. I do want to tweak the brightness index for cobble. It seemed to be a little bit inconsistent across the years. But what I really like to do is expand this analysis to the floodplains across the North Pacific Rim. We have floodplains delineated for this range. So there's over 9,000 individual floodplains that we already have delineated, and ultimately link this to salmon productivity. That, any questions?
That was 14 minutes and 59 seconds.
No way.
Excellent. Excellent.
So we've got 5 minutes for questions for Diane. I have a few, but I want to give everybody else a chance to ask them. Great presentation, by the way, Diane. Really, really cool.
Yeah, I think it turned out really nice.
I have a quick question, Dan.
Yeah.
For the, I know a little bit about random forests, and I was wondering, so I was trying to relate the maximum annual maximum temperature to the forest, whatever, to increase in the vegetation. So you're modeling each year.
Oh, I forgot to mention that. I used a 7-year rolling mean. I found better results, and I probably need to talk to Johnny again to determine how you choose the best rolling mean. Because when I started with just yearly data, I didn't get hardly any correlation, which makes sense definitely for the PDO using a rolling mean. I'm very novice in statistical analysis, so thanks to Johnny, he helped me work me through this project.
Well, again, I'm just curious about the mechanics of the forest. So you model each 7-year period. So each 7-year period, you take that, like, is your unit of analysis in terms of vegetation change and like.
And the variables, yes, yeah.
Gotcha. I see. Thanks.
Other questions?
Diane, does the grain size of the channel matter for the salmon?
Yes, it does. And I haven't really looked into that. And, you know, some of them prefer finer sediments versus the porous, yes. And I'm not sure if all 6 salmon species occupy this watershed right now, but I'm pretty sure they do.
I was just wondering if that big lake that was forming now at the base of the glacier as it retreats, that's probably capturing a lot of sediment from the glacier.
Yes.
Would that be a good thing for salmon or a bad thing for salmon?
It might be a good thing because of the fringe of the shoreline, like sockeye would spawn there. So yeah, I
Okay.
think it would be a good thing.
Okay.
Couple of minutes left for questions. Well, if no one has any, Dan, I just want to say again, fabulous work. You know, it looks like Earth Engine and leveraging some of these tools is really going to allow you to scale some of these questions to the places where I like to go, you know, where you're talking about entire biomes and entire, you know, Pacific Rim impacts for, you know, salmon, which is just great to see. Really like the way you brought in multiple aspects of the class with the linear regression model, the SMA, Landsat, and you overcame, you know, a lot of that cloud and effects that, you know, are typical, but really amplified in, you know, coastal BC. So,
Yes.
you know, all things are really important. I think when you end up publishing this will be really important work for folks to see, and a really important kind of methodology, I hope, that expands into the rest of the region you're working on. So great job.
Yeah, and I've been wanting to do this type of analysis probably for at least 10 years. So thanks for letting me in the class.
Yeah, so make more salmon so I can put more in my freezer. That's all.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, guys. So we've got about a minute left, but let's maybe use that time to let Elise prepare here. She's going to be next with her talk. So Elise, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. Let's see, share my screen here. All right. Yeah, so I guess I'll just jump right into it. For my project here, I was looking at conifer encroachment in the High Divide region in southwest Montana. So just as some background here, I'm sure all of you are aware there's some pretty significant issues with conifer encroachment here in the Western United States. And just to preface, I did not make this map, but it's a useful tool from the rangeland analysis platform that shows really the percent of tree cover increase all across the Western United States. So it's kind of a nice visualization of how broad an impact tree encroachment is having into grasslands and shrublands here in our part of the world. So as we've kind of started to realize really how large of an extent conifer encroachment is occurring over, conifer removal has become a really popular restoration technique to bring back a lot of these rangelands and sagebrush systems for cattle grazing, as well as for a bunch of threatened and endangered species. And primarily, the main species that has been looked at is the greater sage grouse. So we know a lot about how sage grouse respond to both conifer encroachment and removal. And they clearly do much better when there are no trees on the landscape in terms of abundance and reproductive success. And they're also kind of thought of as an umbrella species for a whole bunch of other sagebrush associated organisms. So there's often this assumption that if habitat management is good for sage grouse, then it will also be beneficial for a bunch of other sagebrush associated organisms. But we don't always really go in and actually test those assumptions. So that's kind of where my dissertation work is heading. So I'm looking at sagebrush songbirds to understand how conifer encroachment and removal is impacting their abundance and reproductive success, especially as kind of a species, a set of species that's supposed to be under the umbrella of sage grouse. So we do know a little bit about sagebrush songbirds. A lot of the research that's been done has really focused on abundance data. So looking at point counts to see how the abundance of these birds responds to kind of percent of tree cover on the landscape. But there's nothing really known about their reproductive responses. So we know the sagebrush obligate species like brewer sparrow and sage thrasher are more abundant when there's fewer trees on the landscape. But does that also correlate to higher reproductive success? And then how do some of these other species respond, like green-tailed towhees, who are an early successional kind of forest species? And then some other generalists and conifer-associated species, are they being harmed by conifer removal? So that's kind of the big picture of my dissertation work. I'm looking at quantifying the impact of conifer presence and density on sagebrush songbird abundance and nest success. So my methods here for my dissertation in general, I have a fairly small scale field site in Southwest Montana to do this nest searching and monitoring, territory mapping to understand abundance, and collecting vegetation data. And just because of the logistical restraints of finding and monitoring all these songbird nests, it really does have to be at a pretty small spatial scale. So my field site overall is only about 7 square kilometers. But my ultimate goal with my dissertation is to take what I learn from my local field site and extrapolate that to a broader scale. So take the results of songbird productivity, so that's abundance, combined with nest success, to understand, a whole bunch of things. Looking back, how many songbirds have we lost due to conifer encroachment? How many have we gained in the areas that we've already removed conifers from? And how can managers remove conifers to benefit the most species and reduce impacts on other species that might not have benefits from conifer removal? But I'm kind of still in the middle of this process. I'm still collecting data. So I'm still trying to understand how I can extrapolate my results to a broader scale. And one of the big questions is what spatial scale I should use to extrapolate my results over. So that's kind of where this project comes in. I wanted to look a little bit more into how conifer has changed over time in a region of interest in Southwest Montana, and where we can do conifer removal, how much, like what percent of the area is covered by conifer, and kind of start to build a tool that could both help me understand where I can extrapolate my results to, but also be beneficial for managers in the region to get a better idea of where good conifer removal can occur. So for this project, for this class, I use mostly the rangeland analysis platform. So to answer the question, how has tree cover changed over time? I did that linear fit of tree cover change between 1985 and 2020. And then to understand where some of those areas of good conifer removal are. Using the current conditions, I made a mask of kind of low percentages of tree cover that would be reasonable to remove, so about 2 to 20%, but also shrub cover that's available. So trees are encroaching into all sorts of different habitat types, but I'm interested here in shrub covered areas. And then I combine that with the tree cover increase mask. So I'll just kind of walk you through what I did here. This is the polygon I was using in Southwest Montana. You can see it's just south of Butte and kind of follows the Montana-Idaho border. So this is the linear fit of tree cover change over time, where red is a decrease in tree cover, yellow is no change, and green is an increase in tree cover. So it's pretty clear here that there's definitely more area that has had tree cover increase than decrease, but I kind of wanted to ground truth this a little bit. So I'll show you a smaller kind of zoomed in area close to my field site. So here, just to kind of orient you, in the middle of the picture is a valley. This is the Medicine Lodge Valley, and on either side is kind of higher elevation, moving into forested areas. And a lot of the tree encroachment is occurring kind of downslope. So the forests are expanding down the slope. So this green you see on top of the image, that's from that linear fit where I just pulled out anything where tree cover had increased. So there's a lot of increase here in the forested areas where just the overall cover has increased, and kind of along the edges too, but you can see pretty reliably there's no cover increase in the valley. So that's a good sign. But there's a lot of this area that we're not interested in doing any sort of removal in. If it's already fully densely forested, we don't want to go in and try to remove those conifers. So the next thing that I did was put this blue mask over, and this is the mask of areas that have tree cover between 2 and 20%. So something that we could go in and reasonably remove. And then also, again, kind of over 15% shrub cover, these areas that would be beneficial to sage grouse and some of these sagebrush songbirds. So then I looked at the overlap between those two areas, and that's the red you can see here. So the red is our low abundance of tree cover, but that tree cover has increased since 1985. And as we would expect, it's kind of along the edges here where trees are just expanding into these kind of sagebrush meadows and expanding down slope. One thing though here, some of these sagebrush meadows up here, these are part of my field site, and I know that these have a low percentage of sagebrush cover. These are my control plots. So it seems like this model didn't really pick up some of the really low sagebrush cover areas that could be good for removal. So I think this needs a little bit of tweaking to really get kind of the best areas for conifer removal. But it's kind of a first shot at it. And so what I found with this in this region of Southwest Montana was about 245 square kilometers of potential removal area. And we've already done about 50 square kilometers of removal here in this area. So kind of moving forward, there's a whole bunch of things that I want to do that I haven't gotten to yet, but I'm really excited to keep working on this. So to refine this potential removal map, I want to look at things like aspect and slope in some of my conversations with managers who are actually doing this conifer removal. Slope can be really important because just of the logistics of getting in there and removing trees. So identifying areas that aren't too steep. Also understanding land ownership. So how much of this potential removal area is on private versus public land. And then also understanding woodland and sagebrush habitat type. So this is beneficial for really understanding which species might benefit from removal in different areas, as well as helping me understand where I could potentially extrapolate my results to. I think, since I'm doing my work in high elevation, mountain big sagebrush, I wouldn't really want to expand out of that, but we don't really have any tools right now to identify that habitat type. So kind of the next step would be to figure out how to find extents of these different sagebrush habitat types. And some of the things that could be important there, elevation, definitely. Different sagebrush species and subspecies are more abundant at different elevations, as well as soil type and precipitation. And I think that could be really, really beneficial, both for my project and more broadly to understand which species might benefit from conifer removal in different areas. And then I also want to investigate a whole bunch of other variables over this region, including some climate variables and NDVI that might end up going into my final model of songbird productivity over this region. And again, just kind of understand, for this project, I use this polygon in Southwest Montana that had been used for another conifer removal analysis, just because it was convenient. But again, identifying these other sagebrush habitat types and where they are could be really beneficial, because right now it's just kind of the boundaries of a few watersheds, which may or may not reflect sagebrush habitat types and where my results might be good to extrapolate to. So like I said, there's a lot I want to do still, and I'm really excited to keep using Google Earth Engine as I continue to work on my dissertation and beyond. And so I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Elise. Great talk. We've got about 7 minutes for questions for Elise.
Elise, that was a great talk, and really appreciate your use of all these different tools that you've learned this year. It's very impressive. I just have a general question. What are the factors that cause the conifers to move down slope like that and take over the sage lands? Do people understand that, or is it something that still is not known?
Yeah, so kind of the standard explanation is shifting fire regimes. So less fire since European settlement is kind of thought to be the main driver. But I think it's also a pretty complex issue that varies a lot between different regions, other types of disturbance, as well as carbon in the atmosphere and soil type. There's a whole bunch of things that influence it, but for the most part, fire regimes are kind of the main driver.
Okay, great, thanks.
Elise, you mentioned that you're interested in soils for your future. Anyway, you wanted to look at soils, and I'm just wondering, do you have some certain data sets in mind? Because it's something I'm also interested in for a separate project, and I'm starting to think about like soil data availability. So I'm wondering if you have any information.
I haven't really looked into that yet. I think I need to do some more work to understand what sagebrush habitat types exist on different soil types. But just kind of I think I did a quick search in the search bar, and there's a few different soil type data sets available, but I'm sure Patrick would be able to speak to that more.
Oh, that's cool. And then my other comment was going to be, I wonder if for looking at the practicality of removal, if looking also at like distance from the road or something would also be another useful thing to add to your analysis.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a great thing to add.
I was wondering, Elise, if instead of focusing on sagebrush species for your habitat typing, if you had thought about using ESDs or maybe sagebrush height or some other metric, since the species can be kind of hard to tease out, especially remotely?
Yeah, sagebrush height, it could be a factor in there. I was kind of thinking the way to figure that out would be to model a whole bunch of different variables, but I think sagebrush height could be important along with the things that I mentioned. And what was the other you mentioned? ESD? Is that ecological site descriptions?
Yeah.
I looked briefly at those, and those could be useful in a model as well to kind of predict different sagebrush habitat types in this region.
Other questions for Elise? They're not, at least one suggestion I had, Elise. First of all, again, great talk. It's nice to see those things all kind of come together and utilizing the tools. It looks like you're going to have a nice platform to extend your results to once you get to that point in your dissertation. Something to consider as well, looking at a species distribution model or habitat distribution model to actually measure the ecological factors that are influencing or predictive of the sites that you're actually utilizing is a way to then stratify that broader landscape polygon you have currently. So you're not measuring directly the floristics, but you're measuring all those ecological conditions that surround it. And so there's a lot of really good presence-only kind of models you can develop through the SDM package and other things in R that you can really leverage those Earth Engine outputs from to get to that point where you can have a probability of habitat occurrence across your site as a footprint, and then maybe say, I want to work within this core area to get you going. And I think right now you have all the tools in hand to really pull those right metrics out in Earth Engine that many folks don't have access to. So that would be my suggestion moving forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited. There's so many things to keep working on.
And if there's no more questions for Elise, we've got a minute, and what I'm going to do is give that minute again and pass it over to Ryan for his talk, I believe, on predicting and mapping snow in Northwest Montana.
All right, let me share this. Okay. So, yep, I was hoping to map perennial or persistent snow and ice for Montana, and specifically, I just limited it to Glacier National Park for this project. So my goal was to create annual maps for the minimum snow and ice extent for the park using the Landsat archive. And obviously this is my project for this workshop, but it was also of interest to the Montana Natural Heritage Program. They maintain field guides for plant and animal species, but also for ecological systems, and they prioritize those systems using a ranking that kind of estimates like a state priority, similar to like a threatened or endangered species kind of system. But in order to assign those rankings, they need to quantify things like area lost or vulnerability. So having accurate maps over this time period would give them some basis to assign those ranks more accurately. I talked a little bit about the Landsat fractional snow covered area product last time when I was introducing the project, but again, that's a scene by scene classification of snow covered areas, so very similar to what I'm trying to produce. But you can imagine when you're trying to do these longer time series analysis, having these scene by scene classifications, it's very time consuming to download all of those for the full archive and make use of them. So Earth Engine could really make this more efficient. And then I also came across this time series of glacier retreat data set, which is a vector-based data set that the USGS put together. And you can see in that image of the Sperry Glacier going from yellow to red, they are manually delineating the perimeter of the glacier in 4 different slices in time. So 1966, 1998, 2005, and then also 15/16. So they did this for those 4 time slices for all the named glaciers in the park. And then interestingly, in 2005, they expanded that to all of the snow and ice features in the park. So that was a handy data set to have access to. So my plan of attack was to start with a single test scene and classify the snow in that scene, and then compare that to the Landsat fractional snow covered area product from the same day. And if that was looking okay, then scale up to trying to create these single images for minimum snow and ice coverage for each year. So 1 image for each year in the Landsat archive, and then quantify the change in snow covered area and visualize that in some way, put the results into an app, and then assess the accuracy. So to start with, this was my test image. This is from August 28th, 2017. And you can see my 4 classes there that I was hoping to unmix. So I just use static end members. So the red markers are snow and ice, green is exposed rock, blue is water, and green or yellow is vegetation. Here's the unmixed image from which I was just trying to pull out snow. There's definitely some confusion happening between the other classes, especially water and some of the shadows and things, but I just pulled out the snow and then brought that down onto my desktop to compare with the Landsat product. So the image underneath is the image I was classifying, that single scene from August 28th, and that's the snow and ice that I predicted in Earth Engine. And then the Landsat product will be in yellow. And I think overall they were pretty similar. The Landsat classification looked to do a little better job of picking up kind of the edges of some of these snowfields and maybe some stray patches of snow and ice, but also seemed to have a little bit more noise, maybe a little more confusion with this cloud in part of the image. But overall, I was pretty encouraged and decided, at least from like a gut check point of view, it looked good enough to move on. So in terms of scaling up, the kind of workflow that we've used in this class quite a bit, you set your date range and get a collection of images, mask out any unwanted pixels, apply a reducer and get a composite image. So in my case, I'm trying to get a single image that I can then classify snow in for each year. But I quickly realized that I was going to have issues with using masks. So clouds and snow, as you might imagine, look very similar to in terms of their spectral response. So the only difference in this image is that I applied the cloud mask in one and not in the other. And I was careful just to make sure I was only masking out clouds, but it seemed like I was going to have issues trying to do any sort of masking at all. So I decided to just abandon the cloud mask or the mask in general and used a minimum reducer when I was scaling up to create these composites. And those 2 images on the right, the top one is from 1984 and the bottom one is from 2020. So those are minimum composites for each of those years. And my thinking in this case was, a cloud is super bright, but is going to be mobile, so not covering the same pixels in every image. So ideally, you're going to end up getting whatever's underneath the cloud when you apply a minimum reducer. And then in the same thinking, snow is also very bright, but I'm interested in finding pixels that are snow year round. So if it is permanent snow, it should be bright in every image. And if it's not, by applying a minimum reducer, you should end up with whatever land cover is underneath the snow. This is the best I could come up with. It's not perfect because, as you could probably imagine, it could enhance shadows in the images, right? If you're always taking the minimum value of these pixels, you're going to end up with whatever's the darkest. So in that case, it could enhance the shadows. But overall, I was pretty happy with how these minimum composites were turning out. So this is what I went with for this project. And I did put this into an app, so I'll try to pull that up really quickly. Let's see if I can get it. Earth Engine was running really slow this morning when I pulled this up. So if this isn't loading, I'll just tell you about it, but hopefully it'll load up. So that's the boundary of the park there. And then over here on the left, you can select from any of the years in the archive. And so if you click on 1984, it will zoom in and show the predicted snow and ice, and then the minimum composite that I used to classify the snow and ice. And so you can pan around, zoom in here. And I also added those inventories that I was mentioning from USGS. So you can turn on these polygons and see the glaciers that were mapped in each of those inventories, as well as in 2005, they mapped all the snow and ice in the park. So that's all in here as well. And you can switch years and it'll reload the map with a different year's image and prediction. Then I also incorporated this chart to try to quantify the snow and ice area for each year. And this you can download either as an image or as a CSV. And hopefully I'll try to send a link out maybe, and people can play around with this and give me some feedback. But moving forward onto trying to assess the accuracy, to be honest, this is what I spent a lot of time on and probably struggled with the most, was how to best attack this. The approach I came up with for now was trying to make use of those vector data sets and do some sort of comparison that way. So what I did was I took those vector layers from those different slices in time where they had inventories and converted them to rasters with a constant value. So anything within the perimeter of a glacier, or if it was 2005, a glacier or a snow and ice feature, now was a raster with a constant value of 1. And then from there, I could take my predicted snow layers and create binary rasters. So set a threshold to say above this percentage of snow in a pixel is going to be called snow and below it is not. And then mask those by the boundaries of those glaciers. So this gave me a way to basically look at like an error matrix where everything within those glaciers should be a 1 in my classification, but might not be. So that's in this top table. What these accuracy measures are displaying is the accuracy on those snow and ice or the glaciers, excuse me, based on my classifications. And you can see over time, going back in time, like towards 1998, it seemed like the classifications were more accurate. I don't exactly know what's going on. Maybe the imagery they were using for the delineation was not as high resolution spatially. So maybe they were just getting more accurate over time, whereas maybe in 98, the pixel resolution was closer to what Landsat is. And then the number in parentheses here is when in 2005, if you remember, they had all the snow and ice maps. So if I added that to my accuracy assessment, you could see it drop the accuracy pretty substantially, which I think has to do with the timing of the imagery that they used probably when they delineated it, but also just that some of those smaller features are probably harder to capture. And then in the bottom table, I also tried to assess the accuracy using the area of snow and ice. So in 2005, like I mentioned, they mapped everything in the park. So theoretically, my snow and ice cover should match pretty closely to what their inventory was. And you can see it's in the ballpark, but definitely not as close as I would have liked. So I think there's a lot of ways I would like to refine or redo this accuracy assessment. But the one thing that I will say that was positive about this approach, kind of doing these two things simultaneously, was it allowed me to identify an ideal threshold for classifying something as snow or not. So if you can imagine, if I were to say, oh, anything above 5% snow is going to be considered snow in my classification, then my accuracy estimates in that top table would shoot up and be super high because I'm classifying most of the landscape as snow. But then that bottom estimate of the area of snow and ice would also shoot up and be completely unreasonable. So this gave me a way to kind of test out different thresholds and say, oh, this is maybe the best I'm going to get in terms of managing, like keeping the area of snow and ice in 2005 relatively close to what it should be, and keeping my accuracy estimates about as high as I can get them. So that was one positive of this approach. In terms of next steps and things I'd like to work on or are working on, I'd like to keep playing around with the masking, and not just for clouds, but also for shadow. Maybe expand my temporal window a little bit. I was just using images from August 1st through the end of October to try and capitalize on when I thought snow would be at a minimum just naturally on the landscape. And then I'd like to play around with adding an elevation mask or an NDVI mask just to eliminate some of those pixels that might be getting classified as snow, in lower elevations or in densely forested areas. As I mentioned, I just selected end members statically, and I tried playing around with the dynamic selection using both NDSI for the snow, the normalized difference snow index, and then NDVI for vegetation. And I just wasn't getting as good of results as if I just went with static end members. But I didn't spend a ton of time trying to make that work. So that might be something to look into in a little more detail. And then also I just pulled end members from a single image and used those end members to unmix all of the other images. I'm not sure that would stand up to maybe like a critical review, but I felt like that approach was working the best. And I'm not totally convinced that it matters to take the end members from the exact image you're trying to unmix, but I'd like to do more research into that and kind of see what other literature is out there about that. In terms of the snow cover, the area of snow cover, that chart that I showed, I didn't normalize it by precipitation, which I definitely need to incorporate that in some way, or even just look at, potentially large precipitation events in that window of time. I started bringing that data down and didn't figure out a great way to incorporate it into that chart. And then finally, I want to try to spend more time with the accuracy assessment. I think in some ways, the way I have it set up, I'm sort of comparing apples to oranges in that I'm comparing my classification using Landsat imagery to some classification or those manual delineations that were done using either NAPE or worldview imagery. So it's a little bit hard to make the direct comparisons. I think a better approach would be me to do some manual delineation, even though I kind of try to avoid that at all costs. But I think that might be a good way for me to, look at the images I'm actually trying to classify and say what is getting confused with snow and ice in my particular images. And then I could also try to use, like I mentioned, the NAPE imagery and maybe unmix the NAPE image and compare that more directly with the inventory that the USGS did. But yeah, anyways, a lot of things to still work on, and excited to keep moving this forward. But that is all I have for now. So love to hear any feedback or questions. And like I said, I'll try to send that link to the app out if people are interested in poking around with that and giving me feedback there as well. So thanks for listening.
All right, Ryan, awesome talk. Love the technical insight, accuracy assessment you brought to the table. All that stuff's really impressive. We've got about 3.5 minutes left for questions for Ryan. So I'm gonna let everybody swing before I do. So any questions for Ryan?
I just wanted to say that I liked your animation that you had in there of kind of like going through the ArcGIS and with the slider and stuff. It was really useful to like see kind of like that before and after. That was cool. It's a good idea.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tyler.
I just wanted to say, great job, Ryan. I think that it's really hard to get good accuracy, I think, when looking at snow, because there's just so much spectral overlap with clouds or other things that are bright. And so I think that's a really tricky thing to get at. One comment I had maybe for future things, if you're trying to look at a better way to eliminate clouds, instead of using a minimum, I'm not sure if maybe you tried a median, but that might help. You mentioned an issue with shadows, but a median value could work. The only issue with that might be if you're in an area that has really persistent clouds, and then your median might actually end up being cloud. Yeah, you could look into that. Great job with the app and the slider and ArcMap. All of that was really cool. Science communication, though. I liked it.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I tried a little bit with the median, but I was running into that problem where my time window was narrow enough that sometimes there just weren't enough cloud-free images to make the median work. But I think expanding the time window, I might be able to do a different reducer. So thanks.
All right, Ryan, I just want to say that was awesome. Since clouds are my nemesis, I am going to be in contact with you. So keep up the good work. That was awesome.
Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Any other questions for Ryan? And maybe Ryan, I don't know what all the bands you use in Landsat. Did you use the whole portfolio or just kind of the 6 or 7 visible bands that we typically use for? You may be expanding that may give you some additional capacity to differentiate clouds, and even using additional data sets, perhaps. And I don't know for certain, but I'm guessing the GS has more cloud-specific algorithms they apply to different sensors that may be, just give you more flexibility to differentiate, because people are dealing with the same, I think, challenges you are between clouds and snow. They really want to know what snow is. So I'm assuming there's probably some stuff out there. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's with that fractional snow covered area, they give you a revised cloud mask that comes with it that I think they must be using, something a little more refined, but I couldn't find the like secret sauce anywhere. I don't know if they put the algorithm out there yet. So maybe when they publish some stuff on it later, they'll reveal that, but you can download it. You just can't, I don't know how to make it, I guess.
Yeah. One quick plug too. Ryan showed you a nice app that he built. We're going to have, I think, some sessions post this end of the semester for folks that are interested in building apps, because we didn't get to it in class. So if folks want to circle back, I'll have an email list going out for folks to do that. But I want to jump now to Lee and not take up any of his time. So Lee, I will turn it over to you for the next talk.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Ryan.
Sorry, give me a second here. All right, you have me?
We're good, yep.
All right, so yeah, my project is looking at differential sensitivity of late summer music resources to climate trends in these 3 broad eco-hydro regions of the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains regions. And really the need behind this within my department is related to the fact that Nevada is a very large state. It's the driest state in the union. Most of our water resources are in private hands. Our funding is very limited, and there are multiple disturbance drivers on the landscape that have really degraded music resources over time. In particular, our sagebrush obligate species really track pretty well with the availability of music resources on the landscape, and that might have to do with the availability of open water, or it might have to do with the availability of food resources, or thermal cover, or a number of other issues. But at any rate, really focusing in here a little bit on sage grouse, because they are in particular dependent on these late summer music resources. And I'll get to that in a minute, but long-term estimated population declines of over 80%. And by long-term, I'm talking about the past 50, 60 years. For sage grouse populations are a real problem on the landscape for us. Late brood rearing habitat in particular with successful broods is really limited in type and extent. And we know that the distance to and the distribution of music resources on the landscape influences population success and brood success. And really, in large part, that's driven by the fact that adult grouse rely on sagebrush for their diet, but chicks early on can't process terpenes in sagebrush, so they can't eat it. So they eat insects early, and then later in the summer move to a more forb-based diet before they're able to eventually feed on sagebrush itself. And there are a whole host of other issues and variables that are important, like cover, obviously, and the ability to avoid predators. So kind of jumping out of that and over to the flow here, my project is really looking at the status and trend of that late summer, late brood music resource on the landscape. And again, we've defined that July 15th to September 30th here, and we're doing that within the broad regions, 1984 to present. I will say that July 15th to September 30th window it's pretty arbitrary. We know that window moves, especially if you look at some of the information that's been published out of Utah over the past few years that looks at when that window of music resource really is available on the landscape. That changes year to year, but in any case. So the next step is to look at climate trends within these broad regions and also to extract those at the HUC 8 level and to do that by water year. And then to tie those back so that we can see what the climate drivers of music resource response might be. And then the next piece that I'll talk about that I want to move on to eventually is doing a little bit of forecasting as well. So in my workflow, again, is to cut out those trends within music polys. So I cut the music polygons that Patrick provided to his eco-hydro regions. And then I overlay a grid and spatially join that back to the music poly so that I can then ingest those into GEE and run the NDVI time series code with the addition of the large shapefile loop. And that's essentially to avoid those memory processing errors so that we're chunking up the landscape and pulling these out as individual CSV files and then merging them back together on the back end. So no surprises there. It's pretty straightforward stuff. And here's just an example of working on that in northeastern Wyoming for one of these subsections. And these are the trends that I have pulled out. And you can see the trends do vary by region, and in particular, we're interested in Great Basin because we think it's probably got some of the minima. But I think I would ignore these lines. I haven't pulled out the regression coefficients because I don't really want to rely on linear models to get to that, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. But you can see there's been, in particular with alfalfa cropped areas, a large increase in the greenness of these in late summer. And we've seen some increase in certain other resources over time as well, or at least apparent increase. When we look at the trends on the landscape, however, we can see that they're really pretty spatially variable over small scales, small extents. This is just a linear regression reducer. Looking here at a part of northern Nevada, it's Paradise Valley and the Santa Rosa Mountains. And you can see in particular this area around Paradise Valley has had a real decline in certain areas over time. And it's an area that probably was, endorrheic groundwater dependent, a lot of riparian wetland areas, but it's also traditionally been hayed, and there's been a lot of disturbance on the landscape that's come from incision and from changes to the water regime, and that has largely to do with surface irrigation. You can see other areas, though, other drainages where agriculture is really not as much of an influence, and yet we've still seen declines over time. kind of come back to this in a minute as well, but this is another area where, it's likely that management has had a large influence on the landscape, and that's one thing I'm not looking at right now. This is up around Burns, Oregon, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and you can see again some real changes over small extents in time. They're probably management driven more than anything else. So I'm going to jump over to, and here you can just see the count of polygons with increased or decreased NVI over time. In general, a lot of these increases are pretty small. I want to go back and rerun this and change this to percent cover, because this scale here is kind of hard to comprehend since it's so small. But again, this is the information pulled out of that linear reducer and just the count of the polys. So extracting the grid met covariates, again, I use the eco-hydro regions for broad regional trends. Because these are multi-part polys, I did area weight those means so that they, made a little more sense. I'm working right now on extracting the grid met covariates at the HUC 8 level within each of these broad regions as well, so that I can tie those back to the polygons to run the random forest. I am still in process with that. If you haven't worked with HUCs, there's the hydrologic unit codes out of the USGS. These are the sub-basin codes, and really they're about 700 square miles on average across the US. They're kind of like medium-sized rivers is the kind of the best way to think about it. I'm gonna have to go back and iterate through this. I did have some memory errors over the past week when I was trying to run this. So I'll probably go back and reuse or adapt some of that large file code and just use an iterator over the HUC to pull these out. But nevertheless, you can see I've got these grid met trends within the broad regions, and this is pretty consistent through the Great Basin. You can see precipitation and SWE have been fairly static with either a slight increase or slight decline over time, but mean daily max temperatures and potential evapotranspiration have really increased over the study period. And so when we look at the Rocky Mountains, it's more or less the same pattern, a fairly flat precipitation, small decline in snow water equivalent. The outliers on the ends of these do mess this up a little bit. These are just GLS lines. But again, a mean daily max temp increase and a PET increase. And in the Great Plains, we're actually looking at kind of a different dynamic, an increase in precipitation, a slight increase in SWE, not a huge change in mean daily max temp, and maybe even I'd say a static to small decline in PET. So what I'm working on now is, instead of relying on these linear fits to look at this, because there's so much noise and so much variability, is chunking these, both the climate variables and NDVI into two groups, a 84 to 99 and a 2000 to 2018, and just using a Wilcoxon paired test. And that's really just, basically a non-parametric paired t-test, right, to look at effect sizes in a before and after group. And kind of take these with a grain of salt right now, because I'm really still working on these. But in particular, the precip here is just an example. But you can see the NDVI within the Great Basin over this period. There was a small actual increase in this, and a tightening up of the standard deviation. I'm sure I'm probably going to find an effect size when my computer finishes running this. It's been stuck in R for a while, but that's mostly because the N is just ginormous. But you can see here an example, just a box plot that shows the precip for the first time period to the second time period within this broader region, and kind of the effects we're looking at here. So I know I'm running through this kind of fast, but what I'm working on right now is, again, finishing that HUC 8 extraction and then going back and running the Wilcoxon at the HUC level within each eco-hydro region. I pretty much got all that code written. It's just taken me a lot of time to process some of this on the back end, both in GIS and then over in R. And as soon as I get that done, I'm going to merge that info back with the NDVI and run the random forest to get the climate variables importance levels. And I'm really thinking right now about how to handle some of the additional covariates I might want to pull out, because management, I think, on some of these classes is going to be fairly important to look at. Other things that I need to really do is go through and review the code, review the code. And I'm kind of thinking about overlaying some of the LTDL data set for these areas as well, to see if I can figure out anything that might tell me about management history of these areas over the past 30 years. So I'm not sure where that may or may not get me, but I'm probably going to do that at any rate, just to see what proportion of these areas within the Great Basin at least have been that we have any kind of management activity for, or particularly where we've done treatments on the landscape. So yeah, like I ran through that a little faster than I meant to, but I guess I'll open that up to questions, comments, thoughts. And this is one of our projects here in Nevada. You can see kind of our pre-post fencing project where we've gone into one of these riparian areas and done a little bit of work.
Awesome stuff, Lee. I'd love to see the data, because I'm close to all the stuff you're doing, and I think this initial run you did looks great, and the patterns I'm seeing are what I expected. So I think you're definitely on the right track, and we'll have time to talk about that. But I want to give everyone else time to ask questions about Lee's great work too. So open it up to the floor.
I have two questions. One is, well, just about these photos. Is this fencing for like wild horses, or what are you fencing out there? Who are you fencing out?
Yeah, this is mostly feral horses here. And with a little bit of work with the permittee to change season of use and duration of cattle grazing as well. But this is an area with a lot of horse impact.
I see. And then you may have mentioned this, and I just didn't hear it or missed it. So are these NESIC resources? I wonder if we know they're like precipitation or groundwater driven, and how does that affect your analysis?
Yeah, and that's a good question. That's why I'm working on pulling these climate variables out at the Huckate level and then tying them back to the NESIC polygons that lie within each of those Huckates, and then I'm going to feed that into the random forest model. And I kind of wish I had that done by today. It's probably going to be next week or the week after, honestly, but that should give me an idea of that. And right now I've just got it on a water year basis. I've thought about doing a little bit of maybe pulling it out on a month-by-month basis and doing a little bit of like a lag analysis to see how timing of some of the precip might impact this. But a lot of these are snow-driven ecosystems. A lot of them are groundwater-driven as well. So that's definitely the next step. If that answered your question.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like cool stuff. Looks kind of complex.
Yeah, Lee, I just want to emphasize great talk and a lot of great work. And on the groundwater thing, in your pictures, there's obviously, as we all know, driving around in these landscapes, there's a lot of pivot irrigation now from wells. And I don't imagine if it's, like most places that I'm aware of in the arid West, that there's any groundwater monitoring sites or many in the area. But I'm just wondering if some of the decrease, like this is the excellent picture to show that, you see a decrease in the riparian areas, in the mesic areas, but you obviously see an increase in irrigated ag from groundwater. So I'm just wondering if, what you think the connection, like Svetlana's question, between the groundwater system and these riparian areas is, or if people looked at that at all in a more of a regional scale. I know they've looked at it a little bit locally in some of these places, but what are your thoughts on that?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Johnny, because I actually meant to mention that too. I think that groundwater pumping is probably driving a lot of the increase in the late season haying on these fields. And that people are probably going for a third late season cutting in a lot of these areas. The state engineer's office here controls groundwater pumping. I don't know that they have great records going back in time because they really didn't have monitors on most of the wells. They do now. That's a requirement, but I think it's still probably pretty patchy. There's some folks at the Nature Conservancy who are doing a lot of work on this specific issue, or at least some work that I think will have impact on it. And I can't say that I know a lot about it other than having said in a very, very brief talk here. But in one of the sub basins that I worked in down around Yarrington here, you can watch the water table fall as water is pumped every summer for haying operations. And that's been a real problem there, but because it's not just an agricultural area, there are people with domestic groundwater wells in that area too who have had their wells go dry just from this very issue. So it's definitely having an impact.
Okay, great, thanks. Or not great, it's awful, but thanks.
Hey,
Other
Lee?
questions for
Yeah.
Lee?
I think it would be cool to do your reducer at, at least your 2 time periods too, to see if there's a big shift from the early years to the later years, or maybe break it up into more time segments. I think that'd be cool to look at.
Like the linear regression reducer?
Yeah, right. What do you have on the screen there? Break that up into different time periods. See if there's a big shift in the later years.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. And I think that's kind of one thing that I wanted to get at here. That might let me look at this shift here over time, which I know just looking at this density plot doesn't necessarily do a lot for everyone maybe, but I am curious about that too.
I think once, Lee, you get to the point where you can go in and look at the different land use types or ecological drivers. So if you go from that groundwater system and those, lower areas, which are really affected by pumping that's occurring perhaps with center pivot extraction, versus those higher elevation systems, which are just really snowpack retention sites, the sensitivity in those is very, really different. And once you look at that and parse that out, and may look at change it, if once you remove the alfalfa from all that increase you saw in the Great Basin is probably going to look way different. And so you're going to be able to really parse out sensitivity by ecological drivers, and that's going to be really, really cool once you get to that point.
Yeah, so if I could ask you, that's what I was working on over the past few days that I'm not quite finished with, is running the Wilcoxon for the 2 time periods, but subbing it out by the different resource types.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you're suggesting, but I've also thought about overlaying the polygons and just deriving mean elevation as well to see within each resource category how some of those covariates might be impacting sensitivity as well. Do you think that's a good idea?
It is only to the point that you can normalize elevation across broad areas, which is, not constant, but we'll have time offline to talk about that. But yeah, lots of ways to break it down to get to the questions you're asking. But just for time's sake, we need to move on to Gina. But awesome work, Lee. And yeah, we'll be talking more, I'm sure. So great to see all the awesome progress you're making on that stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for sharing so much of this with me. It's been a huge help.
No, it's great. We're so lucky to have you working on it. A lot of people are going to benefit from your outputs for sure. I'm going to turn to Gina now for the next 20 minutes and listen to the work she's been doing. Gina, the floor is yours.
All right, let me make sure I share this appropriately here. Oops. We've got one too many screens here.
We had you there for a second, then we lost you.
We had
Were you
to
seeing the
disappear.
presentation mode or like the notes and stuff?
I think we were seeing the presentation mode, yeah.
Oh, you were? Okay, great. Let me try that again.
Yeah, we've got a picture of a floodplain. We're good.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank you. I always seem to have trouble with that. So I'm Gina. I am a grad student here at UM, and I'm working in the geography department. I am hopefully going to focus on some beaver activity in eastern Montana. So my original project, starting back in December, was to investigate some low-tech riparian restoration out in eastern Montana. Lee gave us an excellent introduction to some of the issues we're seeing with mesic resources and arid landscapes in the western US. And so building off some of the information he was able to provide, I can go ahead and say that I was gonna hopefully look at some of the restoration techniques and see if they are actually helping or improving the vegetative productivity in eastern Montana. As I started learning more about this project, I found that the data I was hoping to come across doesn't quite exist in the spatial and temporal scales that would really provide a trend analysis. Most of the data I was able to get my hands on were restoration sites that had been implemented back in 2020 and then some projected for this year. And so when I say restoration sites, I'm talking about generally low-tech restoration, but beaver dam analogs is one popular method for restoration. And so that's basically using surrounding vegetation and materials to put in these analogs in our streams. And hopefully that increases the surrounding vegetative productivity, as well as the sinuosity and braided riverscape in the area. And those studies have been done in several Western states, but we haven't really done many studies here in Montana. So I was hoping to focus on that here. And so because I'm unable to find the data, I am going to use this assignment to really investigate my study area and compare different data sets to look for patterns. So my very general study area is here in eastern Montana, just north of Fort Peck Lake. I am focusing here specifically because I started out working with a PhD student who has a couple field sites out here. And so that sort of guided that initial study area. But in general, I hope to broaden the scope to all of eastern Montana. So the methods I attempted for this project were, well, generally, I'm interested in the changes along the floodplains, the vegetative and both the either sinuosity or increased surface water. So I started out with time series NDVI, and I reduced that to the regions of the reaches that I am aware of. I also tried to utilize some LiDAR imagery to look at different elevation, slope. We are really lucky to have some LiDAR out there, so we have pretty high resolution DEM data sets. I ended up not being able to use that, and I ended up, there's a BRAT tool, the Beaver Restoration Analysis Tool. I think I got that wrong though. But they actually had some data in there that I was able to pull out for some valley bottoms and focus in on those areas. I also investigated the spectral mixing analysis. I unmixed both water and vegetation. And then finally, I looked into the linear fit trend analysis of both the NDVI and the NDWI. So to begin with the NDVI, so there are about 6 different sites that were identified by the PhD student that I'm working with, and he was able to identify current beaver activity in these sites, which is really cool. This one behind these pictures, all of the pictures in this slideshow are of natural beaver sites in eastern Montana. And so they all show a general increase in the mean NDVI surrounding the area. And so I did use, for those, I did end up using the LiDAR floodplains, LiDAR-derived floodplains. So this is what I expected, or at least hoped to see, was increased NDVI. And this is similar to what I think Lee was presenting with some of his work. Then I moved on to experimenting with the spectral mixture analysis. I decided to utilize the annual model. I found that the mixture analysis identified quite a bit of vegetation, and it was pretty noisy for me when I'm really just interested in the floodplains and the areas right along the water. So I pulled out the Valley Bottom shapefile from the BRAT tool and pulled it into Google Earth Engine so I could just look at the changes in NDVI, or I guess it's more just the percent of greenness within these floodplains. And so it's a little rough because I opted to simplify the polygon versus tiling the polygon and bringing it in because there were so many nodes. I also looked at the trend analysis, the NDVI trend analysis. And so this is an area where these black dots represent known beaver locations. This also came out of the BRAT tool. And I thought it was kind of interesting because at first when I looked at it, it seems like these areas where beavers have been identified, it looks like it's kind of orange in there. It's green around the sides, but orange. And so I think that's water. I think that's increasing water and not just vegetation. So if we zoom into this little area, these again are beaver sites where beavers have been identified. And actually, I think it's actually where beavers have constructed little dams. And so there's increase in NDVI around the surrounding water area. So we have some increased surface water also, which is really cool. I wasn't seeing that at first, but once I pulled up the histogram of the slope, the different slopes of the trend analysis, I was able to set my visualization parameters correctly. And I also think it's pretty interesting because overall for the study area, the surface water has decreased. And, but in some of these beaver areas, we can see that it's increased. And so I'm not discovering anything new here, but exploring the study area to kind of try to learn about some of the different patterns and see where I can go from there. And so this is just an example of where this is Big Warm Creek, and we can see what that actually looks like without it being covered with pixels. Here's another example of the trend analysis where, again, these are all little beaver sites. And again, this is natural beaver, not restoration. And so we can see that there's a trend of greener NDVI surrounding. I don't know how valid it is to say that this greenness surrounding this riparian corridor is directly due to these beavers, but it's a pattern to investigate. And similarly here with the water. And so this is the NDWI pulled out with the trend analysis, and really cool that we can see how much water is pooling in these areas where this beaver is pretty active. And one thing I'd like to do in the future is there are some beaver sites that I know of, but not a ton of beaver sites. And so I'd really like to focus on identifying some known reaches and actually delineating those reaches where the beavers are active. And then identifying some control reaches where we know there's no beaver activity whatsoever, and look at the trends in both of those separate areas. I have more further research to do than research that I've already done. I have a lot of questions surrounding these little guys, which I'm sorry that I don't have a picture of beavers in here for all of you, because there are quite a few little cute pictures out there. So I'm really curious if and how beavers are impacting the resiliency of eastern Montana landscapes. Some ways that I was thinking about going about that would be to correlate evapotranspiration with damming intensity and also looking at precipitation trends. And then in Patrick's paper from 2019, and some of the work he's presented to us also defining hydro periods, he summarized by my bi-monthly presence of water in each cell. So I think that'd be really neat to try to figure out some of these different periods and see how they're progressing over time. And moving beyond that, in terms of resiliency to drought, I think it would also be interesting to look at Eastern Montana beaver restoration, beaver dams, in terms of resiliency to fire also. It's a pretty active fire area out there. And I know that some projections into the future are predicting, at least for this summer, that it'll be one of the drier places in the state. And so I think that down the road, maybe not within the scope of time that I'm studying it, but it'd be really interesting to look at fire activity in relation to some of this beaver activity. And then I'd also like to scale up to look at more than just these smaller reaches that I've been looking at, just to explore the study area. That's all I've got. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Gina. That was great. Really cool stuff. Beavers are just such a, they're such a force in the landscape. We let them do what they've evolved to do, and especially in the time of increasing temperatures and the need for investing in climate resiliency. These guys are built to do it for us. So it's really neat to see what you're thinking about and how that might work into future conservation needs. We have some time for questions for Gina, so I'll open up the floor to folks to ask questions. Are you guys tired because it's second to last talk of the day?
Oh, no. You can't be
So much
tired yet.
That was a really cool talk. When I was in grad school, I think I've mentioned it before. My research was on remote sensing in mountain meadows, and I almost went looking at beaver stuff. And so it's really cool to see someone working on remote sensing and beaver stuff, dams and their effects, and beaver analogs. So I just think it's really, really cool work.
Thank you. I think of them as kind of an underdog, kind of an overlooked resource for restoration.
Yeah, they're awesome.
So Gina, do you have any plans to try to compare different sites at the detailed level, that the restored sites and non-restored sites that are similar in other ways or something? That could be real interesting to kind of tease out the regional effects from climate or other things from the local restoration response. And also, I want to just say that was really a great talk. I think it's amazing that you can use the Landsat image and see such detailed things on the landscape, as small as these little beaver dams and pools. It's really great work.
Yeah, I wasn't sure I would be able to see them. So I was pretty excited when I could actually get something out of it. So thanks, Patrick. And to answer your question, Johnny, about looking at the restoration versus the natural beaver sites, that's what I really wanted to study going into this project, was compare restoration, natural beaver, and control sites. But I am having trouble finding some restoration data that dates back. It'd be nice if it dated back 5 to 10, 15 years to actually seek out some trends. But like I said, the only data I have right now is from maybe even 2019, but 2019 through 2021. So really small scale changes for that, and not really relevant to the larger picture of what I'd like to look at. But maybe a student down the line in a couple years can look at that.
Yeah.
I assume that you've read the research of Sherry Westbrook, but she seems like to be kind of like one of the preeminent beaver kind of hydrology researchers.
Westbrook's not a name that I recognize, so thank you for bringing that up.
I'll send the name in the chat.
Thank you.
Gina, just kind of following up on Johnny's question, have you thought about how you're going to identify those control reaches that don't have any beaver activity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that might be challenging since my part of this project is really remote sensing. I do have a resource of this PhD student who I'm working with who has some project sites out in eastern Montana. So he's kind of like my eyes on the ground for any of this, and hopefully I'll be able to go out there with him sometime and check out some of these areas. I'm learning so much about this every day. So I think getting eyes on the ground, and that's just for very specific sites, but for a large scale, if I want to blow this up to eastern Montana or even the west, then I don't know. I think it might, yeah, I don't know. Maybe talk to land managers or see what they think. I don't know how often beavers move around either, if they're there for 3 years and then leave, or if they, yeah, so I have a lot to learn.
Yeah, good luck. That sounds complicated, but fun.
Thank you.
I just had a quick thought about trying to identify control reaches, but you might be able to get after some of that by looking at, like, I don't know, maybe at like density of beaver activity within a reach, and say that how is that correlated to the amount of surface water change. You know, you might not be able to find ones that are absent of beavers, but maybe some that are like way less active or something like that.
Yeah, I think that would build on a lot of other research that's been done too, in terms of dam intensity in a certain reach. So yeah, that's a good idea, Ryan. Thanks.
Hey, Gina, that was a great talk, and I really liked how you were able to see some effects using NDWI and NDVI. I think you hit the nail on the head for next steps when you were talking about incorporating a hydro period analysis, because I think I'd be really curious to see what beaver dams do in terms of temporary and seasonal wetlands, and I think that would be a really cool way to look at that. But awesome, I'm curious to see where it goes from here.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
I'll have one last question or suggestion for Gina. I know we've talked before, and we'll be talking next week, Gina, about looking at our Western Beaver Reach data set and pulling that in. That's something that Tyler, myself, and Johnny have been working on, and a way to link that to climate resiliency. So where we know we have known beavers, looking at places and how they're affected outside of those watersheds that do have beavers is something I think that's critically important. We're looking at in the context for migratory water birds, things like greater sandhill crane breeding habitats and their associate values, and looking at it strictly from the ecological side of things, and just, resiliency is critically important too. So I think you'll have some space there to explore through that if everything kind of goes down that path for you. But that'd be my next suggestion, is resiliency and climate resiliency within Western watersheds is critically important now. And your work could be a key to help explaining that to us in a broad way with Earth Engine. So I think there's a lot of potential.
I like that word. Thank you.
With that, we want to give full amount of time to Svetlana for her talk, who's up next. So thank you, Gina. Awesome stuff. And Svetlana, you are up.
Okay. So let's see. My project is not focused on a particular location, but more on an idea. So I'll tell you guys about climate analogs, how they're used for climate impact assessment, and the importance of the choices that you make to characterize climate. So whenever we're talking about climate analogs, I always start with a motivating question of how will the ecosystem of interest will respond, how will it respond to climate change? And it's not a simple question, because, say, ecosystems consist of multiple individual species that all may have different response to climate change. So understanding how those individual responses scale up to the ecosystem level is not obvious. And this is one kind of practical example. So we may want to know how forested biomes of the 20th century will transition to the end of the 21st and the 22nd centuries. So we know that some of them may transition to shrublands, some of them will stay forests, and some may become something else. So I study one of the ways to address that question called climate analogs. And climate analogs are locations that share a similar climate. To give a specific example again, any location that has a similar climate to Missoula's right now would be considered Missoula's current climate analog. So we can then use this idea of climate analogousness together with climate change forecasts to ask, where does the future climate of my location of interest, so where does the future climate of Missoula occur today? So here, if different colored tiles represent different types of climates, and we know that Missoula is going to get this kind of dark orange type climate, which is indicated here with the arrow, we can find locations on the landscape that have that climate now. We can then take it one step further and ask, what are the kind of ecological features that are associated with those locations, and use that as a model of what may be coming to Missoula in the future. So in this particular cartoon, I'm looking just at the ecoregions, and 3 out of 4 of Missoula's future climate analogs have this dark green ecoregion. So I would forecast this dark green ecoregion. So this type of kind of analysis is getting applied, at least in the science community. So folks have looked at changes in dominant vegetation in North America, as well as areas of expected forest loss. And they've used climate analogs to look at the changes in agricultural yields, as well as actually changes in the kind of wood production. And I think last time, I forget who asked me about this, kind of another useful application of climate analogs is identifying areas where novel climates may emerge. So, and the way you do that is if you do not have, so we talked about how you can try to find locations in the landscape that have your future climate now. And if you don't find any of those locations, if you don't have anywhere where your future climate occurs now, you can predict that your location is about to have a non-analog climate, meaning we don't have any examples of what ecosystems look under that future climate now. And that is important for conservation or restoration purposes because that those are particular areas or those are areas of particular uncertainty. So you may want to either invest more money into it by monitoring it, or maybe disinvest into it because it's too risky. So of course, kind of these predictions, kind of our predictions of climate impacts depend on depend on where we find these climate analogs, and where we find climate analogs depends on how we define climate. So that's one important issue. And I think last time I talked about how currently when we define climates, characterize climate for a given location, we usually use climatic means. So what I mean by that, so even if we use, say, seasonal temperature, like maximum temperature of a given, like maximum summer temperature, something like that, we usually average that maximum summer temperature over a chunk of time, over like, say, a 30-year period. So we're using a mean of that parameter. And the issue with using means is that they are not necessarily representative of the overall distribution of your climatic variable. So here we see 2 curves that have the same mean. So say if this is a temperature curve, these 2 curves have the same mean, but they have different variance, which has implications for kind of the tail end behaviors. So the solid curve climate will have more kind of extreme hot temperatures and extremely cold temperatures. And actually what this picture doesn't show is that even if we account for variance, kind of the behavior at the very, very ends of these curves is not well represented by the standard statistics. So by describing mean and variance. So that's something that we're not capturing. And those extreme climatic events may be ecologically important. So kind of the first example, and I'll give some examples of that. So say extreme floods, like 100-year events, may have engineering effect on the ecosystem, controlling or resetting the riparian vegetation. Kind of extreme climatic events have, this is one example from the agriculture, that they have a strong effect on agricultural yield. So all these dips are associated with some kind of extreme weather. And also closer again to the world of ecology, we know that including extremes kind of improves species distribution models as well. So extremes may be important for at least some systems. So I wanted to use my project as an opportunity to look into this, to see if climate analogs that we define based on climatic means, if they capture the incidence of extreme temperature at the focal location. So yeah, so another way I wanted to see if, and for this question, I'm using contemporary climate analogs. So if we have this location X, which is our focal location, say again, it's Missoula, and its current climate analogs, I want to know if the probability of extreme temperature or the magnitude of extreme temperature is similar in my focal location to those analog locations. So if these analog locations can predict my focal location's extreme temperature. And I'm using contemporary climate analogs mostly because to kind of characterize extremes, you need finely temporally resolved data. So meaning that I need like daily, hourly, or daily data, and those data are really hard to obtain for future climate. Mostly, it's monthly averages. So so I'm just kind of trying to see if our concept of analogousness. So I'm using contemporary data because we do have those finely temporally. That fine temporal resolution for contemporary data, and it still gets at my general question. And oh, I guess this is my illustration of what it may look like. So I kind of mentioned earlier that to look at the extremes, we use separate statistics. So I'm going to use fancy extreme value statistics just to look at the distribution of extreme temperature at the focal location and the analog locations. And I'm asking if my distribution for the target location, which is here, say it's here in blue, for example, if it looks the same as the analog locations, or if the analog locations are shifted. And I used a case study approach, meaning that I looked at 2 focal locations kind of to investigate this question. So I estimated extreme summer temperature return interval by extracting the hottest summer temperature for the 1979 to 2019 period in the focal location, as well as the analog locations. Then I model the extreme temperature probability and construct a return interval curve, which I'll give an example in a minute. And so there's a little more information in this map over here. So I have a focal location here in yellow, and then my analog locations have different colors. That's because, so I've been talking about climate analogs as being kind of either being analog or not. So in reality, within that category of analogousness, we also look at the degree of climatic similarity. So analogs can also be of different quality, so to speak. And I can talk about it more if people have questions at the end. But here, kind of darker colors represent more climatically similar climates to the focal location than lighter locations. Yet they all would be considered climate analogs. So my data and workflow were fairly simple, I think, compared to all of you guys. But I extracted daily maximum temperature from the ERA 5 data set, which we've talked about TerraClimate in this class, but TerraClimate only has monthly historical data. ERA 5 is another kind of reclassification. I don't know. It's another climate data set that has very finely temporally resolved climate data from hourly, so ranging from hourly to daily to monthly. But they provide climate data that's slightly more spatially coarse grain at 9 kilometer pixels. So I extract daily maximum temperature for each year. And this is what it may look like for a given location. So I just have one data point for each year because it accounts for maximum temperature for a given day that occurred there. And then I used the R package extremes to model extreme temperature, probability density function, and return interval for the focal and analog locations. And this is what that return interval function may look like, or return interval curve. So these numbers don't correspond to these data, but the idea is that you have some kind of level of temperature, and then you have a period in years of how often can you expect that particular temperature to occur. So I'm going to be mapping these curves and comparing them. So here's my case study 1. I have this focal location, again in red, that corresponds to the red curve on the right-hand side. And the dashed lines are the 95th, represent the 95th percentile or 95% confidence interval for that curve. And the other colored curves are the curves for the analog locations. And the different colors correspond to climatic similarity to that focal location. Again, with the darker curves being more similar, they would be considered more analogous, more climatically similar. So, and this looks pretty dismal, right? So one, the confidence interval is super narrow and there's like not much variation in terms of kind of hottest summer temperature for the focal location. And none of my analogs, not even the closest, the most climatically similar ones really capture the hottest summer days at my focal location. And some of them range by as much as like 10, they're off by as much as 10 degrees. So, so I thought to myself, well, maybe this is a special case because I'm looking at this kind of coastal location where the influence of the ocean perhaps has a moderating effect. So my focal location has like a really even climate, and just slight movement, inland has a large influence on those kind of hottest days. So then I handpicked a more continental location in central Montana, or maybe that would be even considered eastern Montana, just to see, what kind of effect kind of continentality may have on the ability of analogs to capture those hottest days. And here are my curves for the continental location. So again, maximum summer temperature, I guess I didn't talk about it, but maximum summer temperature on the vertical axis and expected return interval on the horizontal axis. And again, the dashed lines, the red curve is the focal location. And here, well, there are two things. One, my confidence interval is much wider, as I guess expected. There's more variation perhaps now that we're away from the ocean. And at least some of my analogs are somewhat capturing, they're kind of within that 95th percentile confidence band, but still it's kind of a hit or miss, and it doesn't look like climatic similarity. So the color of these lines doesn't really doesn't necessarily directly correspond to whether those lines are falling within my 95th percentile confidence band. So all in all, I would say that kind of based just on these two case studies, it's not necessarily promising that that my climate analogs that are defined on climatic means, they're not really capturing climatic extremes, which is something that maybe I expected, just again, based on knowing, about statistics of the extremes, but that's kind of just a confirmation. So I guess what we can conclude from this is that we may want to be mindful of how we characterize climate for your purposes. And maybe this is a no-brainer for folks who do species distribution modeling, because perhaps you're picking out the specific variables that are important for your system. But within the climate analog community, there has been little exploration of the effect of climate variables that are used to characterize climates on the kind of outcome of the model. And I guess the next steps would be to ask if a more complex way of characterizing climate similarity yields a better capture of extreme climatic events. And also perhaps trying to scale up this analysis to the landscape level, which would require kind of one of the, I mean, it would be great to have an ultimate product that perhaps colors your pixels or colors your analog pixels based on those analog pixels' ability to capture the incidence of extremes. And for that, I would need to come up with some kind of metric that captures kind of the overlap of these distributions here. And I do have some ideas, but it will require some additional statistical wizardry. So with that, I'll take questions if you guys have any.
Thank you, Svetlana. We have time just for a couple of questions. It's 1 o'clock right now. I don't want to keep people beyond too much, but questions for Svetlana.
I have a question for you. This is Gina.
Yeah.
Maybe you went over it and I missed it, but I'm wondering, how are you picking the focal locations and how are you picking the surrounding potential analog locations?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I did not go over it. So, okay, I have a slide here that kind of describes how I pick. Whoops, I don't know. Can you see it, or is my?
Yeah, we can see it.
I think my chat. Okay, there we go. So so my the focal locations. So those focal locations I picked out from a different study that I'm doing, but they're pretty much any pixel in the Western U.S. So it was a random. But because I didn't want to look at all the pixels in the Western U.S., I just like picked 2 random ones for this particular project. And then the way climate analogs are defined is, so for a given pixel, we measure, I consider kind of climatic similarity between my focal pixel and all the rest of the pixels in the Western US, right? So that's a separate process that I did in a different project. But the way that's done is that, so here's my hypothetical climate space over here. Say it only has just 2 climate variables, say it's like temperature and precipitation, right? And here's my focal pixel. And then I have this circle of analogousness that's defined by the interannual. We calculate it by kind of measuring the interannual variability of the climate of the focal location. And then I map all the, I mean, I don't do it by hand, but the idea is that you map the rest of the pixels in this climatic space. And you measure the different, you measure the distance within this climatic space between your kind of focal and all the potential analog pixels, right? And then you pick out the ones that fall within the circle of analogousness. And this is kind of my illustration of what it looks like, how this kind of climatic space may translate into the landscape space, where I have these 2 kind of analog locations and 2 non-analog locations. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So it starts out. It's an iterative process,
right?
Yeah. Pare it down to. Okay,
yeah, it's a long. I mean, it takes like. Well, it takes like a day to run on like multi-core Yeah, it's a long process. Yeah. It's relatively simple, but just computationally intensive because you're comparing that climate pairwise for all those locations.
Be one more question for Svetlana before we wrap up. Okay, thank you, Svetlana. That's going to be really cool stuff. I mean, interested to see your final products when you guys get all done with that stuff. A lot of implications for species distribution modeling and projections in the future. Really, really neat stuff. Just quickly, for next week, it'll be the same format. So we'll all be jumping on again, 15 minutes for your talk, 5 minutes for presentation, 20 minutes total. Hopefully we'll try to get you out of there as close to one as we can, like today. Great talks, everyone. Again, I just get inspired by seeing what you guys can do with this stuff and how you're changing conservation and the way people are thinking at scale using these tools. So I'm really grateful for the work you guys are doing. Any questions before next week or anything from Vicki or Tyler or Johnny as well would like to add?
No, and I just want to say too, Patrick, these are great presentations. People are just doing such incredible work. It's very impressive. It's good to see.
And very diverse work. So I think it's a nice span of people utilizing Google Earth Engine in different ways.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there's no questions for any of us directly, Tyler, do you have anything to add? Sorry, I didn't know if you had anything.
Not really. I think I love this part of the class, getting to hear from everybody. It really gets the wheels turning on ways to use this stuff. So thanks to everyone for showing us what you're doing.
I will post the recordings on the share drive when they're ready to go. So if you guys want to, share that around with other folks that couldn't make the call, that'll be available. And if anyone has any questions on their upcoming talks between now and next Friday, please reach out to myself, Tyler, Johnny, and we'll get you guys in good shape and hopefully hear another round of great talks in a week.
Thanks.
So, thanks, everybody. Great work again. We'll see you in a week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Vicki, do you want to hang on for a sec?
Okay.